indicated, my work is intersected with the Commonwealth Secretariat, particularly around the SDGs and the kind of some of the earlier thinking about the SDGs. And given Ben and Lynn's presentation, I think what, in one sense, I'm doing is maybe summarising some of the points that they were made and thinking about how they fit into wider trends that we may see and think about in regard to research, evidence, knowledge, and knowledge use in regard to the SDGs. And I think it probably echoes some of Ben's kind of questions about where the gaps are and where our priorities may be. So I think if we are to think about the connections between research and evidence and sport and SDGs, I think we have to think, first of all, about the fundamental orientation and nature of the SDGs. They are, many of us in this room will be very familiar with them. Some may not be. So, you know, there hasn't been, for example, in the UK, a great deal of as much as maybe even some other European countries in engagement with what the SDGs are and across the sports sector, from my experience. So I think it's important to say they're universal. They apply as much to the global north and countries in the global north as they do the global south. The initial text, this is quoting from the initial text that came out with the Sustainable Development Goals. They're integrated and indivisible. They're supposed to be interlinked and coherent with each other. I think we can argue perhaps whether that is always the case, both in theory and practice with them. But I think that the United Nations kind of statements around the SDGs have consistently emphasized that they're country-led. And I think we should take two things from that. One, that it is in countries that these get implemented. You know, they are connected to global trends, obviously, and global influences. But it's speaking about the kind of leadership within countries to decide and determine and to best try to progress how to achieve the SDGs, and emphasizing that national level being important. So I'll come back to. And Ben and Lynn mentioned SDGs and targets. There's also a set of indicators against which the SDGs are measured, 230 associated indicators across the 17 SDGs alongside 169 targets. I think one point to say, I think when you anybody who's ever started looking at the indicators in regard to sport and physical activity, they have very, very little connection. If we're trying to make a case or investigate the extent to which sport or physical activity contributes to the SDGs, that can't or won't be measured by the indicators that the United Nations set. They're just too far distant from the kind of contributions that sport and physical activity might make. But I think there is something to be said for kind of considering the level of the targets, because I think if we're just thinking about the SDGs themselves and the 17 of them, it becomes too easy to badge anything a contribution to the SDGs. If we want to think more specifically about the kind of contributions and how we might evidence contributions or not of sport and physical activity to the SDGs, I think the targets gives us a way of thinking about this as we'll come through. But as Ben and Lynn said, and Claire introduced, I was lucky enough to be commissioned to be co-author on the Commonwealth's guidance on sport and the Sustainable Development Goals. And through the process that actually preceded that, there was a decision to focus in on 7 of the SDGs, including the overarching SDG 17 around partnership, and dig into the targets around them. I think, you know, it was excellent. Then the Kazan Action Plan recognised those 7, but also extended, I think, into ones that are really important. We didn't have the 2 there, 12 and 13, that were about environmentally orientated. The reduction 10, SDG 10, reduction in inequalities is really important. I think when you then dig into the targets, I think it's possible, and we recognised it in a report and things that I've presented since and published since. Sport and physical activity might be connected to the SDGs and targets in 3 different types of ways. And this is once we start categorizing, there's grey areas and not necessarily all the potential areas. But I think I'll kind of introduce them here in regard to targets and give some examples. So we often think that the contribution of in relation to the SDGs that we can make that's the sport for development sector. That is the approach of those kind of grassroots, new, distinct organization, newer than the traditional sport organizations, newer. They've got specific sport for development approaches, and you can see particular SDG targets that some of their work links to. And again, target 8.6 under the economic and work SDG, or one of them. We have those programs that are specifically kind of designed in the UK and elsewhere that are around trying to encourage young people and targeting particularly young people to try and encourage them back and give them the skills, capacities, pathways back into employment or education and training. We have specific sports development initiatives and programs to strengthen to address substance abuse, for example, or people who have suffered from substance abuse. But if we consider this first one and into the second one and third, which are more broad-ranging, if you like, I'll use an analogy here that came from Oliver Dudfield, who was at one time head of Sport for Development Peace at the Commonwealth Secretariat, now works for Olympism 365. Credit to Ollie for this analogy. Apologies to those who've maybe seen it before. But he drew a distinction. Those kind of sport for development, the kind of organizations, initiatives, and programs in there, he had likened them to a sports car. They've targeted, they're high speed, they're nimble, but they're targeted and they fulfill a very specific purpose. Ollie's kind of argument, which I think you'll see some of what I'm going to say connects to, is if we're really going to take sports contribution and physical activities contribution to the SDGs, we also need the kind of mass transport systems. We need not just to rely on the sport for development sector to deliver it, but we need to engage the whole of interested parties in sport and physical activity, which is, in one sense, is why it's so great to have people on the call here from national governing bodies, for example, as well as those who might be more considered within the sport for development sector. And so that mass transport system, that overall kind of sport system, if we're going to see large-scale increases in participation in sport, which would then, for example, make some evidence, would make some contribution to addressing non-communicable diseases, then that can't be and shouldn't be left to the sport for development sector alone. They will make their own bespoke contributions, but we need the whole, not just of the sport and physical activity sectors, but sectors beyond that to kind of build that at scale to make those contributions in terms of a target like 3.4. And then we shouldn't recognize the sport in its broadest sense and up to elite level as well, and some of the things we see about that at the moment is contrary to some of the aspirations. There's aspects of it that are contrary to some of the aspirations in regard to SDGs. So if we're going to make a contribution, if sport's going to make a contribution, it is about reducing the detrimental impacts. And again, I'll just show a few SDG targets. Discrimination against women and girls everywhere. We see discrimination, not in participation, so there is an overlap here with the second category here, but in lots of other kind of ways within sport, that discrimination against girls and women. So we need to reduce that, and that would be part of a contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. We see abuse and violence happening against people in sport. Again, a fundamental kind of problem in sport and across sport at all levels to different degrees. That again, reducing that and working to reduce that is a contribution to that SDG target. Labour rights and safe and secure working environments, including migrant workers. We see problems with employment, for example, in mega events, and we see problems in, for example, migration tactics in football and other professional sports from the global south to the global north, and how that affects individuals on those kind of pathways. So working, and this is mainstream sport sector in a sense, working and ensuring that those sectors make their contribution by reducing these detrimental effects in part is important. I think if we go then to evidence, and I'll connect these two bits of the presentation shortly. In the document that we wrote, we recognise that evidence in relation to sport and the SDGs is in no way homogeneous. There's lots of divisions, all right, but if we're really going to have a deep understanding of sport and the SDGs and where it is contributing, where it might contribute, where it isn't contributing effectively, we might need to bring together data from different levels, we would call it. So there is that, we had these 4 levels, we can see them on the screen: national level data, drawing from stats on the economy, health, education, sport-specific measures within that, and being able to compare that internationally as well. Is that information then able to be disaggregated to regional and local level to help make decisions at those levels? And then we have the evidence. We're monitoring and evaluating individual sport development or sport for development initiatives that creates an evidence base of its own. And then we have academic researchers and publishing various forms of material. So this kind of slide, and this is maybe where I'm kind of coming to a very kind of generalized picture, looks at those 2 dimensions, the different kinds of approaches by which sport and physical activity might contribute to the sustainable development goals, and the different levels of data. I can't cover all of these kind of boxes, and again, I am going fairly kind of broadly. I'm not necessarily going to cover regional, local. I think perhaps it's a case other people might complement, but we don't really know, and there's probably increasing very, very much kind of diversity, and I imagine a lack of data there. Ben and Lynn spoke about the kind of global sport and SDG impact indicators that they developed through the Commonwealth, and I think the resources on Sport and Dev are really good in explaining that. You know, they are covering those, mainly the ones that are covering the second and third kind of approaches, the improving widespread engagement with sport, reducing detrimental. It's hard to see how the sport for development approaches, those kind of sports cars, might scale up, if you like, to really impact those indicators, and whether maybe people would contest that, but maybe also it's a problem we need to think about. But as the first report mentions itself, there is a paucity of consistent, comprehensive data across the topics that are in those indicators and across countries. So some amazing work and resources, and the Commonwealth and their colleagues are very much to be celebrated and if we think about sport for development approaches, I've put a kind of considerable expansion across both the monitoring and evaluation for discrete initiatives and the academic research. There are some overlaps with academics undertaking some of that monitoring and evaluation, but projects themselves are undertaking monitoring and evaluation. Academics are undertaking research separate from monitoring and evaluation, and sometimes that research, academic research, is quite critical, and rightly so in some cases, of the sport for development sector. I think we've got to again consider, and Ben hinted at this, the unevenness of what's the extent of unevenness of that monitoring and evaluation and academic research? You know, how widely spread is it across countries in the global north and global south? And there are differences there. My colleague Arthur Galliard, who's actually in a conference that I've got to go back to through the room shortly, you know, he also is beginning to make a case of the monolingualism that we see in monitoring and evaluation in sport for development, a focus on English language that excludes some forms of evidence, but equally shapes the research field.
Iain, I'm ever so sorry to interrupt. I do apologise. We've got a couple of minutes left. Is that okay?
Yeah,
sorry
that's
to interrupt.
fine. Yeah, I'm absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got to kind of question the kind of learning that we generate from that. Is it making most use of that? Question the kind of scaling up. Now, Ben spoke about the systematic reviews, and I kind of want, yes, they are useful. How much use are they in practice or for policy when the methods that have been used for systematic reviews do decontextualize? And we need to, I would argue, we need to use methodologies that contextualize to be able to kind of think how much of the learning transfers. And I think a key point that Ben touched on that I'll come back to is about to what extent like this contributed to advocacy. I think we shouldn't ignore the kind of substantial kind of body of academic literature that deals with improved participation and the kind of problematic aspects of sport, but doesn't specifically reference or isn't explicitly geared towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And how might we kind of take that and use that further? So I will conclude on this slide, I think, and again, maybe it kind of summarizes some points or expands on some points that Ben made, that there's gaps in the evidence base, but we've also got to think, and where's our biggest challenge? And I'd almost argue that some of our biggest challenges are in the utility and the utilitization of evidence. But are those gaps at the national level most significant? What are we losing by having those gaps? How does that correspond to where the resources are being put in to evidence, and the capacity and the skills, and where they're being directed to? Do we need to rethink that? On utility, as I said, I think we need to use those methodologies that enable comparison across different contexts to understand what mechanisms work in what context on a broader basis, so that we can think better about what can be transferred. And I really welcome the ComSec's work and other universities' colleagues' work in developing that policy advocacy work. I think as a policy person myself, or academic kind of policy person, I don't think we use understandings of how policy is made enough in thinking about how we might advocate for policy. Policy isn't evidence-based. Evidence only plays a really minute part often in the policy process. And sometimes, and that I wouldn't necessarily argue that is wrong. But if we're to progress these agendas, we need to be better at advocating, using kind of learning from the policy sciences, for example, to advocate publicly to governments, but also to the sport sector more generally, whose contribution and engagement with SDGs in some of those types is really important. So thanks very much for listening. I know across these two presentations we've now overrun a little bit, but thank you very much for listening. It's great to be able to engage, and I do also have to go now, but I will be back for the panel later. Thank you.